Hello everyone, Tame Type 1 here. Today, let's go over how to dose for all the low-carb veggies that you might be eating. Now first, before I get into it, let me just make a quick apology. I made my 3 Keys Diabetes series thinking I had everything I needed in this, but it turns out I was missing one crucial thing, maybe a few, but one of them was vegetables. I mentioned vegetables, I mentioned that you should eat them, but I didn't talk about how to actually dose for them with our insulin. So today I want to rectify that and give you the full guide on how to best go about that. Now before I go on, let me just remind you that I'm not giving any medical advice here. I'm just giving you the kind of stuff that I do in the hope that it inspires you on your low carb journey. Now anyways, to get started on how to dose for low carb vegetables, net carbs, anything like that, anything that's not a meat, basically, because we already went over that in dosing for protein, is what kind of insulin we should use. Now, I, of course, will always recommend our insulin for every part of each meal, including the low-carb veggies. Why? Because, yes, there are some carbs in veggies, although a lot less in the high-carb foods. The carbs are also slower acting than they are in the high-carb foods like your breads, your sugars, your pastas. It's because vegetables often have much more fiber, and that fiber makes digestion a lot slower. And because it's a low amount of carbs and a high amount of fiber, those carbs tend to hit you a little bit slower. And because of that, you'll want to use a slower insulin, like our insulin. Now, there is more than one way to skin a cat, so you could use Humalog or Novolog, especially if you have a pump that can do an extended bolus and you can take a dose and have it go for 2 hours or something like that. That could work, but keep in mind, usually you're not just eating vegetables alone, I hope. You're eating meat too, so you might have to account for that protein rise, and it's not ideal. Typically, I say our insulin's better because you're using a slower insulin for a slower rise from the low-carb food you're eating. It fits with the food a little bit better, in my opinion. But you can do it however way that works best for you with your situation, what you have access to. Now, how much should you dose for your vegetables? Well, that can be very simple, and there's a few ways to go about it. But first thing to remember is that what you have to do is start with a baseline and treat it like an experiment from there. Just like when you're dealing with protein, you have to start somewhere and simply see how it works, tinker with the numbers, and keep working with that dose and with that food until you figure out the proper dose to keep that blood sugar at a flat line. Now, to get your baseline, there's a few ways you can start. The first way, I'll go about what Dr. Bernstein says in his book, Diabetes Solution. And he talks about a whole list of vegetables he recommends, including mushrooms and cabbage and spinach and cauliflower and all the rest. And he basically says that you can take a 2/3 cup cooked of any of these vegetables and count it as 6 grams of carbs, according to whatever your carb to insulin ratio calculations are. And that could work. I, on the other hand, prefer to actually go vegetable by vegetable rather than a one-size-fits-all approach because vegetables can be a little bit nuanced. They have different amounts of fiber, different amounts of carbs, and although it's only a little bit of carbs, so doing 6 grams per 2/3 cup of whatever isn't going to make a big difference, it can make enough of a difference to just so slightly impact that blood sugar in a way you might not expect. So what I do instead is I simply look up the vegetable. Let's say you type in on Google or Bing, whatever you use, vegetable plus carbs, and also include either cooked or raw, depending on how you're eating it. And that matters because whether it's cooked or raw, that's going to change its weight, its volume. It's going to make a big difference as far as your calculations goes. You want to make sure you have that in there as well. Now, when you look it up on, let's say, Google, it might show you a total carb count. Don't just go by that. You have to dig a little bit deeper because there's a lot of fiber in these vegetables, and you need to look at a website that includes that fiber because you can take that fiber and subtract that from the total carbs. Why? Because fiber doesn't really impact your blood sugars unless it's a ton. And in vegetables, it really isn't a ton. There is quite a bit, but not enough to have a huge impact. So you can count this fiber out from your total carb count. They count the fiber in there. Not sure exactly why, just because of the chemical structure is typically a carbohydrate, but it's indigestible, so it's not actually going to have an impact on your blood sugar. So you can take that out. And it's important you do, because if you don't, you might end up dosing double of what you should be dosing, because sometimes it's half fiber, half carbs, actual carbs. So you want to make sure you keep that in mind. Make sure you go to net carbs. That's how you determine net carbs in all these different foods is, they take the real carbs and take out the fiber. That's how they get net carbs. You need to do the same thing when you're dosing. And once you have that number, simply dose it the same way you would with whatever insulin to carb ratio you have as a baseline. Remember, that's just a baseline. That's just where you start. Once you figure out that dose and you try it, you need to see what happens. So you need to test frequently afterwards, see if your blood sugar goes up or down, or remains the same, and from there you can figure out what to do next. Let's say your blood sugar goes too high after you eat, that probably means your dose is a little too low. If it goes too low, it feels a little too high. If your blood sugar ends up just right, congratulations, you're one lucky son of a gun. But keep trying it was just to make sure that's right. And that does mean, ideally eating the same vegetable multiple times in the same amount. That's the best way to experiment. Keep all the variables the same. But you could swap out some of these vegetables and another because they do have very similar carb counts and fiber profiles. Just ideally, it's better to stick to what you like the most because then it's going to be the same. Then there's less variables to worry about. All you have to do is tinker that insulin. So how about timing? Because timing matters a lot as well. If you end up dosing a little bit too early, you might end up low then high. If you end up dosing a little too late, you might end up high and then low. And obviously you don't want either of these things. You want to try that flat line. So when should you dose before your meal full of nice and juicy vegetables? Well, to start, as a baseline, Dr. Bernstein recommends dosing 45 minutes before you eat your meal. Why? Because of the carbs in the vegetables, because our insulin runs a little bit slower. Now, if you're using a faster insulin like Humalog or Novolog, you can probably get away with dosing right at the meal. And this might be what you want to do if you're, let's say, out at a restaurant, you don't know when you're getting your food. But again, that's not going to be ideal because you might end up dealing with the rise later on once the Humalog or Novolog is through. With our insulin's going to run a lot longer and it's going to be able to take care of that slower rise a little bit better. Ideally, you'll want to be able to use that insulin about 45 minutes before, so that way it's time to catch up and start working by the time all your vegetables are in play. Now, if you're like me, you don't eat a lot of vegetables. One reason I didn't make one because I wasn't thinking about it. If you eat a lot of meat and cheese and eggs and stuff like that and very little vegetables, you can probably get away with dosing right before you eat too, but I go over that more in my video on browsing for protein. Now, once you have that baseline, again, you have to experiment to see if that's the right place to be at. If not, let's say you end up going low before you eat, then you'll want to dose a little bit later. Let's say you end up going high soon after you might want to dose a little bit sooner. See what I mean? It's all about tinkering, experimenting, and working out exactly what time works for you. Now, that's about it, but before I go, let me give just a quick note about fiber. Because when dealing with net carbs, this is an important thing to consider. I said before that fiber usually is not going to have an impact on your blood sugar. Unless there's a lot of fiber. Unless, keyword, fiber can have a small impact other than the fact that it makes your food digest slower, it makes the rise slower if you have a lot of fiber, and it can also mess with your gut and a lot of stuff, especially if you're eating any of these alternative keto foods you find at the grocery store, like the Quest pizzas or that Aldi net zero bread that has 0 carbs but it's supposed to be bread. What you'll find is that these foods have a ton of fiber in them to make up for the fact that there's no carbs, even though it would normally be a very carby food. They basically take all the carbs out, replacing with indigestible carbs that go right through you. This, of course, can wreck your gut and it might, in my experience at least, might make your blood sugar rise in ways you don't expect way late after you eat. That's no good. So I would avoid those if I were you. But honestly, when it comes to vegetables, the fiber in that shouldn't be a big deal. I do consider vegetables to be A-okay. Now I understand that vegetables do often have some anti-nutrients, and that can be a problem. That's why I tend to eat more just meat and cheese and eggs and stuff like that. but they're mostly benign for most people. And honestly, they taste pretty good. They're a pretty good way to fill up your meal, so I don't have any big issues with vegetables. I'm not anti-vegetable. I'm just sort of neutral on them. And I want to make sure that you understand how best to dose for them because most people do like vegetables, especially low-carb types, and I think it's important that you know how to make it work for you. So I hope this helps you out. I hope this inspires you. I hope this gives you a little guidance in dealing with the foods you have to eat on this low carb journey where you're learning to tame your type 1. Have a good day, everyone.